Welcome everyone to the Mobilise Podcast. Thanks for coming back. My name is Hamish White, CEO of Mobilise. And today we'll be talking with Kristoffersen, Mobilise's CCO, about the rise of AI in the telecoms industry. So welcome to the show. Always a pleasure. It's been a few months since we did the last one of these.
Thank you for having me again, despite my performance during the last podcast.
Always fun, always fun. So this topic today is super interesting, I think, and AI in telecoms, it's particularly interesting, well, a lot of different respects, but for me in particular, it is really highlighting, I think, one of the challenges that the telecoms industry is having, which is the pace of change, the velocity at which the telecoms industry is able to implement change. And what I mean by that is you look at some of the advancements in AI from the big tech industry, let's say, OpenAI, with ChatGPT, Google with Gemini, Anthropic with Claude. All of these AI models and assistants, let's say, the pace at which they're evolving is quite extraordinary. And I use all of them pretty much, well, not all of them all day or every day, but ChatGPT I would use multiple times a day, Claude maybe a couple of times a week, and Gemini maybe a couple of times a week as well. But the velocity at which they're implementing new features and the models are growing and changing and learning more, it's quite exceptional. But in contrast, when you look at, what's being released in the news from AI, from telecoms companies about AI, it's pretty limited. There's not a whole lot of noise, and it exposes, for me, in particular, an area where the telecoms industry is going to struggle if they don't get on board and they don't start kind of really investing in this space and finding their position to play in AI. There's a real risk that they get left behind at an accelerated rate. Let's just say that I think they're already getting left behind to some degree, but it's going to be a more accelerated rate. So kind of a little bit of opening rant on AI in general, but it's interesting, and I'll throw a first question over to you, Per. There is several statistics out in the market now suggesting that telecoms companies are actually really investing in AI. So there's some statistics out there. 90% of telecoms companies use AI, 48% in the piloting phase, and 41% were actively deploying AI. But I don't see much about that. So what do you think about these statistics that telecoms companies are really starting to invest in AI? How do you see these investments day to day in kind of your role at Mobilise and your understanding of the industry, and where do you kind of think that money is going specifically in terms of use cases?
Yeah, for me, being in the industry for this long is sort of a difficult position. So I always try to take a customer perspective on things like this, on the trends. Because over the years we've had so many technology hypes in the telecoms, and that's what we do, and that's just how it is. We can't change that anymore. People working in telecoms are incredibly fascinated by technology, and therefore the hype is enormous. So I always try to put myself in the perspective of an average customer of a telco, and as a customer of MNO, I haven't noticed anything. But that's also because of my profile being self-sufficient in managing my own connectivity experience and so forth. So I'm a boring example when it goes to that, or when it comes to that, I have to say. Probably what we see and what that statistics show is that they use the chatbots with a certain level of autonomy from some kind of language model. I wouldn't say it's full AI. Maybe it's those kinds of trained models where they sort of have an FAQ that it can sort of quickly browse through and give the closest response. I had a very poor experience with that with Ryanair a couple of weeks ago. I had a very poor experience with that from one of the bookkeeping services that I use, where the question I asked and the replies I got were just no way near. They just grabbed the nearest whatever. There was no real AI looking into it.
Rubbish.
So it was rubbish. And okay, so that's outside of telecoms. So of course somebody has mastered it better. But I think as a consumer or as a user, I think using the chatbots, if you get reliable replies, then it's a super feature. It's a cost-saving feature for everybody. The MNOs should absolutely be invested in that type of reduction to their customer services, and they should be working heavily on perfecting it. And I'm imagining if you perfect that of teaching an AI to reply to these questions, once it's there, then the ability to add a new service and have that serviced by a chatbot immediately once you've released your documentation for the service and so forth, that will be a huge cost-saving factor for telcos.
Yeah, you raised an interesting point there about the experiences that you had with Ryanair and the bookkeeping service. Like, I think the low-hanging fruit for telecoms companies with AI seems to be the agent/chat bot experience and automating some of that flow. And when you talk about that, I think often people immediately say, well, we've had chatbots in the telecoms industry for years, and so why is this any different? But you make a really good point there in that the experience that you get with those chatbots, the purpose is actually to improve the customer experience, or to make it a slicker process, or achieve more efficiency for the customer and for the service provider at the same time. But so often the experience is wrong. It's not right. It's incorrect information that gets returned, like you mentioned. And actually, what happens is it's frustrating. And so the effect is the opposite of what you intend. The efficiency, the better customer experience ends up. You end up frustrating a customer, which is probably the worst thing that you could possibly do. Particularly when the customer is, in most cases, calling in to get help and support. They've already got a problem. They don't need to have further frustration laid on top of that. But I think what's interesting is the AI models that we hear about, kind of, maybe to some degree in the telecoms industry, but certainly in other industries, the chatbot experience with the AI model underneath it, with ChatGPT being the engine behind it, the improvement in the responses and the quality of the experience can potentially be significantly improved. I mean, imagine a world where I never had to be on hold again with a customer service agent. And not only is that awesome from my perspective as a user, as a consumer, but for an operator as well. I mean, like you mentioned, one of the largest cost items in the P&L for a mobile operator is customer service, And so it seems like AI is starting to, drive that use case a little bit more. And I've seen some examples out there today, like Vodafone have their Toby platform. I don't know if you've heard about this before. Toby is an acronym for something. I don't know exactly what it is, but Toby started as a traditional chatbot, and it was the old school kind of model where you're building out a million different scripts and steps in the background, which presents like it's an automated flow, but it's actually just a series of steps. And if there is any diversion off a specific path of those questions that the customer's asking, it kind of craps itself, and you're left with a pretty pissed off customer.
And to be fair, I think that's what my experience that I just mentioned actually was. I don't think it was the real AI, because what I see when I use ChatGPT or Gemini is in fact a lot better. I just think that the experiences I've had is because somebody started this with Ryanair and the bookkeeping company and telcos, and it's the right thing to do. So that they're learning and they're heading in the right way. And what I see from real AI in terms of this is of much higher quality. So I have a very optimistic view on it. I think that's going to be a real asset and a real solid use case for anybody in telecoms.
Yeah, definitely. This is interesting. Like you look at the investment that is being put into AI from different, industry players. And there's some statistics out there, that some of the research houses are putting out in terms of how much investment is being put in by telecoms companies into AI. But, there's statistics out there like, billions and billions of dollars being invested in by telecoms companies in AI over the next 4 or 5 years or so. But I think even if you take the biggest forecasts of what's being invested in the telecoms industry, and you compare it to what you hear about is being invested in like big tech. Like I saw a announcement, I think it was yesterday or today, that SoftBank is reporting that it's going to invest 50 billion into OpenAI, and it's just like this, the amount of money going in to this industry is incredible. And it kind of circles back to what I mentioned before about, like, if you're not at the forefront, and you can't be at the forefront unless you've got massive amounts of money, like, where does it leave everyone else? So that's a question to pose. Like, what do you think if the telecoms industry, falls behind in terms of its investment in the AI race, let's call it? Where do you think we get left? Like, where can the telecoms players or operators play in the AI space if they aren't able to invest at the same level of some of these front runners are?
It's a very, very large amount of money going into it, and being a bit skeptical here, what I want to see is what amount of that is going into the real development and not into hardware, data centers, and so forth, because that's boring. That's operation, and that's much needed too. But really, how much is on making the AI better and better in terms of functionality? That's really what we want to invest in, and seeing it in the perspective of the telecoms from a European mindset. My personal belief is that the telecoms should stop trying to be front runners on technology, on any other than their own services and the services that they can monetize. And I certainly think that for something like AI, they should take it easy and focus on their core business, and then add AI as it makes sense. Trying to be a hyped up technology company for a telco these days is, in my opinion, very difficult. In some parts of the world, and for some companies, it could make sense. But other than that, getting back to telecoms as a utility, which I say as a rather positive thing for the telcos. They are established as an important service as electricity and water and heating. So I think saying that a telco is a utility is a good thing for the telcos. But investing a lot of money and going heavy, unless it's in spin-offs and stuff like that, then I don't see the telcos having a sound role in AI as such.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that's a really good point. Like, what's that acronym? KISS, keep it simple, stupid, something like that. Like, do what you're best at and focus on what you're best at and keep it simple. Don't try to do too much. I think there's real value in that principle, in that statement. We're diving into a separate, maybe slight tangent here in terms of the value of mobile operators and telcos in the value chain. And I tend to agree. I think the challenge that comes in with that principle is a lot of the MNOs are struggling with margins. That utility business model is proving difficult. Maybe that is the business model of the future for telcos, but probably in most markets that will mean there's not room for 4 operators, for example.
Oh yeah.
There's room for 2, let's say. And so there's a disruptive effect. If that's the model going forward, you're going to end up with a lot of consolidation, reduction in the number of, in the amount of choice for operators, for consumers in different markets.
But maybe I'm also, sorry to interrupt, maybe I'm also ahead of the curve in terms of calling a telco a utility. So you
are always ahead of the curve, always. Not maybe, always.
And I don't mean to be cynical about it, because, like I said, I think it's a positive development for telcos, not to be perceived as a high-tech company that needs to keep evolving rapidly, but maybe saying, no, we need to be super good at the core functions that we do and be super lean. And then we can sort of build our business from there. I think with AI and in the telco has a larger impact is the telcos working with their suppliers of systems and software and hardware and so forth, where they get their suppliers to implement the AI to run a more efficient operation, quite simply.
So it's super interesting, and I'm thinking as we're talking, effectively, when it comes to AI, I agree. I think where telecoms operators are going to end up playing in this space, if I was to pull out my crystal ball and or was a betting man, the role is more of a consumer of AI as opposed to a value creator in the AI industry. So, like an NVIDIA or an OpenAI, ChatGPT, they're value creators, like they're building. Telcos will consume those products, and the benefit will be efficiencies and, perhaps operational efficiency type value.
Let me just comment on what I said before. Maybe some MNOs are not willing to realize themselves closer to a utility compared to a high-tech company. And maybe that's also what's costing them a little bit on the P&L, because they're not willing to run their operation as smooth as a utility. So getting back to how many MNOs you need in a given country, it's difficult, and it's also probably a difficult thing to say out loud if you're the CEO of a large, proud company somewhere, that we have been reduced to something we didn't think we want to be, but maybe it makes sense. So that's actually what I wanted to say with what I said before. But I think we have to remember that a telco in general runs some of the largest IT systems around. They have a massive amount of subscribers, a massive amount of customers, and they are really, really good at running very large IT systems efficiently. It's part of their core business, besides the connectivity. And on top of that, there must be value to bring in AI from a given supplier. But the role directly in AI development, I have doubts on.
Yeah, I dig it. I'm with you. I'm going to correct something that I said before. I just did a quick search. The reports were 25 billion that SoftBank was saying they're going to invest in OpenAI. So just like a casual 25 billion as opposed to 50 billion. So, some heavy numbers being thrown around. I'd be really interested to understand. I'd be interested to understand what's the mechanics of that. How does that capex get deployed? It's like the critical part of me comes and says, well, how much of this is just kind of hot air blowing smoke out into the industry? A lot of stuff around, a lot of the announcement that Trump made with Oracle and OpenAI and SoftBank when, I think it was the day after he got inaugurated. How much of it is bluster just to kind of generate hype or look positive, and how much of it is actually realistic and what's actually going to get implemented over time, as that kind of investment gets deployed. But in crazy amounts of money. One of the more obscure use cases that I heard about was NVIDIA and SoftBank again announced AI RAN. I don't know if you heard about this, and I'm going to sound like a novice here, which I am, because I don't know the details of it. But basically the concept was telcos could shift some of the processing of AI in closer to the user, and installed in, set up in base stations. And so it was effectively the business model for the telco was that you could monetize your downtime of your base stations by having AI compute in the base stations, benefit, in terms of the consumer or the model maker, ChatGPT, was that you have a closer, proximity to the user, and therefore, lower latency and better response time and stuff like that. It got announced maybe 2 months ago, I want to say, but that sounds a stretch, is it you really going to do that? You're going to really run like complex AI compute in a base station? I don't know. Sounds far out.
Yeah, to quote Flavor Flav from Public Enemy, don't believe the hype sometimes. But I mean, we all love the hype. But no, I mean, a base station is a very cost-efficient unit that the telcos need to run and purchase at a low price. And in some cases, maybe it makes sense adding more CPU power and more software power at a base station. But I need a little bit more convincing on that one, to be honest.
Got it. Yeah, I agree. I want to shift into some other areas of kind of AI/telecoms as well, and particularly from a regulatory perspective. But very quickly, give me a prediction for telcos. AI game changer or overhyped? If you could choose from either of those.
Okay, so everybody who gets put on in that position always tries to find middle ground. But in the interest of not finding middle ground, then I say overhyped. And if you had asked me the question a little bit differently, then I would say a game changer, but over time.
Got it. I like how you navigated my kind of no gray area statement there.
No, but it's the usual politician. It's a yes and no answer, but there is no yes and no answer.
There is no yes and no answer. Yeah, I think overhyped, and even is there that much hype that's out there? And give me a prediction as well. What is one AI trend that telcos should focus on, like today, like right now? If there was one use case or trend from your knowledge or understanding of the AI industry, what should telcos focus on right now?
I may be fetching a little bit here, but I'm hoping that AI can be used in the network side of things, running the networks, making the networks run smooth. And I'm dreaming about an AI that will be able to manage traffic better, to manage the systems better, to help keep data updated and have high data quality. For example, when it comes to rating, CDRs, invoicing, I'm dreaming of a scenario where AI will help telcos run a more efficient network and BSS and OSS. But I haven't really looked into it. But that's my one of the things that I would love to see happening.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to give my take on it, and like we've started to do in Hero, we've started to do some AI related R&D work, but like the agentic AI. So, you've got agents that are much more powerful than maybe what we've seen before with the traditional chatbot experience. But then also, even with the newer versions of the language models that are coming out and how they're improving the chatbot experience. So that's a low-hanging fruit. I think that's for sure something that operators can generate value from straight away. It doesn't sound very sexy, but I think actually that should be the model or the use case that telcos push into. Don't try to shoot for the stars. Focus on something that is achievable, that customers will appreciate, and just nail it, get it right. But there's other, in terms of what a consumer can do or benefit from an agentic, AI as an agent. There's things like being able to understand products and services that an operator will sell. Maybe you can do things like ask questions about my account. Maybe you could do basic functions like, change some address information. But the really interesting thing, I think, where I'm sure there's a lot more value, but it's when you start to allow those agents to perform actions on behalf of a customer and their account. So, for example, a customer can purchase a service, a customer can change their service, a customer can initiate an eSIM profile download, or effectively, when you think about it, let's use Hero as an example. Everything is available via API. So everything that could be done on a front end UI, be it the CRM, be it app, web, whatever, it's all API driven behind. So you could expose those APIs to an agent and allow them to perform those functions. And that's part of what we're investing and researching to do now. But the question that comes to my mind is, like, you start to get into really hot water in terms of regulation and data privacy. And as a B2B software provider, selling to a telco, like let's say a Vodafone or an EE or a Telefonica, one of these big behemoth publicly listed telcos, that their data is, like so precious, and they've got to be careful about it because they can run in, get into a lot of trouble with regulators if it gets into the wrong hands. Trying to position a product as a B2B provider into a big telco like that, and where we say, yeah, we've got this amazing product that's going to gain you a bunch of efficiency, but you've got to give us access to your private data, to your customers' private data. Like, I can see the majority of telcos go, absolutely no way. Compliance red flags everywhere, security red flags everywhere, just simply too much risk.
Yeah.
So tell me your thoughts on how you think that the telcos could navigate those types of regulatory pitfalls or minefields, whatever you want to call them, in order to be able to kind of reach the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow with AI, which is like complete automation in the network and particularly customer care.
I've only spent around, soon 20 years in sales. I've never found a way to navigate another company's legal department. That's an omission of mine. Mm-hmm. So that's incredibly difficult. No, but it sort of leads me back to thinking the whole US versus Europe at the moment, where they say that there's a lot of administrative restrictions being put on European companies because of GDPR and so forth. And that's my first thought when you ask me something like this. Is it from a US perspective or a global perspective, or if we see it from a European perspective, which is probably where I have most insights, being European and having done most of my business career here as well, then it seems incredibly difficult to start doing something like that. It's, of course, about gaining trust over time. And therefore, I don't think we'll see this happen quickly at all. We will see somebody taking charge, but not in Europe, is my guess. That the concerns we meet when discussing new features, when we have the meetings with MNOs and MVNOs, they're just massive. And it's also sometimes being used as an excuse for not doing any innovation or for not doing anything new. We have projects that are being halted by the legal department for things that are not even remotely related to data or privacy of data. But just because somebody hears something, then projects are being halted. So I'm rather pessimistic in terms of that from a European perspective. So what I would say is we have to rely on somebody else taking charge of this, showing the money, showing that there's good business sense in it, and then it will come at some point. But it's a real risk, and no, it's not a risk. It's more of a handbrake. The regulation is sometimes more of a handbrake. Having said that, everything, of course, needs to be boxed in somehow, and security and trust needs to be super high in order for something like that to fly with access to millions and millions of customers' private data. So, but building trust in the technology takes time, and AI is somehow an abstract danger in our minds. And the telcos surely must be thinking the same when giving it access to their data, their customer data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you make a really good point about the legal teams, and you've got to have a lawyer on your side, that's for sure. So nothing against lawyers, but yeah, their role is, to find the edge cases that may never happen, but to make sure that executives, management, decision makers are aware of all of the possible risk scenarios, and that's their role, that's their job. So when you start talking about creative stuff and the lawyers get involved, and lawyers, the legal department in telcos have a very big role in what happens within a telco, sometimes maybe disproportionately so. And the example that you used before is a good one that we've experienced, is that big projects, fantastic opportunity, all stakeholders in this MNO are on board with it, but hits the legal department and delays the project by twice. But it's super interesting. Like, I think to summarize that bit on the regulatory piece, I see big barriers. I think for us, the way that we're pushing into this is that it's a closed environment. So at the moment, like, if someone is using the Mobilise Hero AI, it'll be internal to the operator. So it's more of an agent that a CRM agent could use, or an admin agent could use, or an operations staff could use, and therefore there's no data being exposed publicly, and there is no person accessing data that isn't already available. It's just being available for them to access. It's just being accessed and processed and and used in a quicker way and more efficient way. I feel like that's that's maybe the model that could be used initially anyway when it comes to customer data.
And then I want to see AI used as an offensive tool, not as a way of upselling to subscribers, as a way of providing a bit of experience, of course, but also churn prevention. That's when it becomes really interesting. But I think that's maybe stage 2 in the rocket for AI in telecoms. But that's where, because if you stop absolutely all voice calls to your call center, you don't get the opportunity to upsell. You don't get the opportunity to make it an absolutely exceptional experience for the customer either. So it's a dual-edged sword, having everything done in a chatbot with a good AI that just works. But some of the best customer service experience I've had is when somebody has said to me, by the way, I can see that you have such and such. You can save this much per month and give you this much more because of so and so. And that was only because it was a voice call and there was a real human there that it happened. So I really want to see the upside of this, not just because there will be a downside to pushing your customers further away to a chatbot rather than personal communication. So we need to take that into consideration as well.
I think, the challenge for Europe, I think in this space and telcos in general, is that, we are risk averse here in Europe. And when you're dealing with something that I think is so sensitive, like AI appears to be, and again, I'm not an expert, but there's a lot of discussion out there about, being sensible, being cautious with AI, and there's a lot of talk now about super intelligence and, a lot of people with red flags up. But I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges here, and it relates to the pace of change question that I mentioned, at the early part of the call of the podcast. Is the way that the pace at which this is moving, it's going to be very easy to get left behind, and there's huge barriers to entry to play in this space because of the investment that's required. And if us in Europe layer on a regulatory framework around that, it's going to be nigh impossible to really move quickly. But let me ask you a question. What would you say would be the biggest risk for telcos if they ignore AI in 25? What do you think would be the biggest downside?
That I feel like in Europe, at least, the telco price level has sort of leveled out, and maybe it's stable now. So that means many of the telcos, in my opinion, are looking for efficiencies internally. And they've been doing this for 20 years. There's nothing new about that. But you're missing out on an opportunity here to run an even leaner company. And if you have 2 to 4 MNOs competing in every single telco is super competitive. It's just endless. So you will be left with a worse P&L. You will be left with customers going to your competitors. And this is something the MNOs keep an eye on all the time, but they're also super tankers. They can't change overnight. They need to be on the money all the time. They need to be watching this, and this is another potential area where you can drop behind if you're not careful. And again, flipping the usage of AI to upsell, to churn prevention, to better customer experience, that's probably where you can lose more customers than by just not being more efficient. So it's super important in a competitive market, which I consider telco to be in most countries, not to be left behind on this either.
Super competitive. Yeah, super competitive.
Pressure's always on, eh?
Yeah. I mean, we could go into another whole tangent there about the competitiveness of the telco industry. It's super competitive, and one thing that you've got to say, as much as there's a lot of negativity about the pace of change within the telecoms industry and the fact that it moves at glacial speed and velocity is slow on new features and stuff like that. On the flip side, when you sit you sit on the other side of the table within the telcos, which I've done in multiple times over my career, been on the other side in a telco, it's hard. Like, it's super competitive. Consumers, invariably, when they think about their telco provider, they think voice, minutes, text, and price point. Like, there's not really much of an audience for more than that. So it's hard to get them to think about other products and services or value adds being laid down that relationship pipe. And, when you think about, how competitive it is out there, 3, 4 operators, 5 operators in a market. And these guys, these execs, they're fighting to, most of them being publicly listed companies, they're fighting each quarter to hit their targets and their goals and keep the stock market up. And, investing big bucks out of slim margins into a high risk strategy just doesn't fit on the radar of these individuals. And for the most part, it's hard. Yeah. It's hard. It's a difficult balance.
Yeah. I'm not using AI for all the things I would like to use it for yet. Let me say like this. I still have to get up in the morning and clock in at the home office.
Yeah, got it.
I have successfully used AI in my reporting work, in my data extraction from our CRM, in presenting the data by simply asking AI to do Python programming for me. I've used it to generate images for presentations, also in my private life, but that's more in the fun category. But what I'm very careful about using AI for Googling. Asking an AI a question seems like there's always many angles on a topic and a question, and maybe I'm just being a bit conservative, but I double check by searching myself and reading up a bit more, although it takes 10 times longer. If you just get a quick reply from an AI, you're done in 30 seconds. But if you have to read multiple sources, it takes 5-10 minutes. So I'm a bit reluctant on that. But I have to say that my programming skills with an AI enables me to do 1,000-fold more in terms of programming, because I never ever learned proper programming besides what I was doing on my Commodore 64 in the 80s. So for that, it's really, really good.
My productivity using AI has gone through the roof, to be honest with you. Like, it's crazy. And I think I've become more and more familiar with how to use it in the best way, and also knowing when not to use it. But ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, I've been using them all. I mean, again, there's many different interpretations of what these models are best for. Like Claude, from what I understand, is quite strong in graphical design. So it's good for creating graphical content, I should say. Yeah, so the different models are supposed to be better at different things. And I think like what generally I think the market says is that by order of ranking, it's ChatGPT, still Gemini, and then Claude, other kind of front runners. But there's very little between them, I think, and in terms of their capabilities. But some may be a bit better, a bit positioned better to do certain tasks like UIs or just content creation or stuff like that for ChatGPT, for example.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Per Kristoffersen, what a pleasure, as it always is. And thanks for your insights. Very interesting. And it's an exciting space. Let's hope that we can capitalize on this as a business, and maybe some of our R&D efforts into AI pay off.
Let's hope somebody's going to hear this and shoot us down and give us some good tips on how we're doing things wrong.
Very good. Thanks very much for your time, Per. Always a pleasure.
Cheers, Hamish.
Speak to you soon. Cheers.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in to YouTube, Spotify, and LinkedIn to catch this podcast. Thanks. Bye-bye.